lucky, blessed to have Dr. Kurt Beek with us today. Let me say a bit about his background. He graduated from Calvin College in the mid-'80s, not to date the poor man too much. Then
86.
1986.
I'm 51. I'm proud of it.
Wait, there you go. Way to claim it. All right. 1986 graduated. Then he and his wife Joanne worked for 6 years in Central America for an international development organization you might have heard of called the Christian Reformed World Relief Committee. During that time, he and his wife were the Honduras country representatives and oversaw some of the Honduran grassroots organizations that then led him to pursue a doctorate in development sociology from Cornell University in New York. He then received a Fulbright to do his dissertation fieldwork back in Honduras, and he looked at how several thousand very poor and marginalized Lenca Indians were able to mobilize and affect positive change in their community. That then, it seems to me, launched him into career work that when he joined Calvin College in 1996, he began the semester in Honduras. In addition to that work, Kurt was one of 6 founding members of the Association for a More Just Society in Honduras, and they seek to create a more just society by focusing on the poorest and most vulnerable sectors through the creation of more just legislature and more just application of legislation, increasing the role of the churches in promoting social justice. Kurt has also been on Al Jazeera 2 times talking about the situation of violence in Honduras. He's very well respected and an opinion that is sought after, not just in Christian circles, but across the world. He also has written 2 articles that appeared in the New York Times. He, on his website at Calvin, has also offered some articles looking at things like if you are a student who wants to have a development-related job, he has resources and articles there. He also has some work on information on how to buy more socially responsible. And I know sometimes our questions are, what can I do today to help make a difference in these situations? So I'd be happy to point those to you. Also, there's a couple of resources in the back. He'll probably say a word about the Honduras semester program, but he joined us from Honduras. He's there with students, and Westmont students have been there before. In fact, I understand that there are some folks in the room whose daughter has done the program before, more than a decade ago. So that's wonderful. I also just want to say a personal word about Kurt, because all of those important things take a lot of time. But as a doctoral student researching the impact of international volunteers on community development, Kurt always answered my questions, sent along his work. I joke and say that he wrote half of my dissertation, but I really utilized his thoughts and some of the impact work that he did and the way that he was thinking about how Westerners can be involved in community development in ways that are not harmful but are helpful. And so he's been a huge catalyst for thinking, again, well respected in the field. And he gets back to emails, and I can't even always say that. So just want to say that we're really glad to have you. A warm welcome to Dr. Kurt Beek.
Want me to put this on? Yeah? Okay. Well, Cynthia's memory and my memory of her dissertation are very different. I remember responding to a few emails, and she talks about writing half her dissertation, which I know is not anywhere close to true. But you're very kind, so thank you. Thank you for inviting me here. It's an honor to be here. I've had Westmont students, including Malia, over the years on our semester, and I really like having Westmont students from other schools in general. So I just flew up from Honduras last week, Thursday, going back on Thursday. Honduras has been home for 28 years, so basically moved there right out of college and have lived there ever since. We love Honduras. It is our adopted home, and I love Honduras, I love Hondurans, I love working in Honduras. It's a great place. I'm a professor with Calvin College, so that's my paid job. We run a semester every fall, so I kind of work half-time for Calvin with my wife Joanne. And yeah, I won't talk much about our semester. It's a justice semester studying justice in Honduras. So if it's open to non-Calvin students, you can ask the Hayashiyas about it, what they thought of it for their daughter. But love to have some Westmont students, and there's some info you can find me afterwards. So what I'm going to talk about today is not about my Calvin College work, but 16 years ago we started an organization called the Association for a More Just Society, and Cynthia asked me to talk about the connections between violence and development, and I've tweaked it a little bit. I'm going to be talking today about violence and corruption. Two topics that you hear about but are often not front and center when we talk about development, and I think they should be. So Association for a More Just Society, it's actually 17 years old in a couple of weeks. Joanne and I and 6 of our Honduran friends started it, and this is our mission statement. We are brave Christians dedicated to making Honduran's system of law and government work properly, do justice for the poor, and inspire others to do the same. Do I have total an hour? Is that what I remember?
Yes, we're supposed to be done here around 12:30, so I can...
Okay, so I'm going to try and do a half hour, maybe a little bit more, and then have time for questions. So I'm going to go kind of fast, but also if I go too fast or you want to ask a question in the middle, it's okay, but otherwise you can jot them down and we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. But this is our mission statement, and I'll just highlight the 3 pieces in blue. Brave Christians, and first of all, I just think something's messed up that those 2 words don't even sound right together. That we do not think of Christians being brave. When you look at the Old Testament, the prophets, the life of Christ, the apostles, they were brave, right? Jesus throwing the money changers out of the temple, that was brave. The way he talked to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, that was brave. If you go downtown Santa Barbara and ask the average person, what's the first adjective that comes to mind when you think of Christians? What would they be? Holier than thou, hypocritical. If they're Christians, maybe loving, kind, but not brave, right? Brave would be 50 on the list. Maybe no one would mention brave. Maybe Christians wouldn't even mention brave. So I think we are trying to help Christians reclaim that we are to be brave. What that means, we're trying to make the Honduran system work. So usually, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, if the public schools don't work, well, Christians set up, we'll build a private school for these poor kids. The medical services aren't working, we'll build a clinic. We're saying we don't want to do that. We want to make the public schools, the public clinics work, because that's going to help the lives of millions of people, not a couple of hundred, and especially for the poorest. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the famous Chinese proverb. You guys can help me out. If you give a man a fish, or a woman, what will happen? He will eat for a day. And it's the idea of charity, right? And the idea of giving is if charity is if I feel like it, right? It's voluntary. So the second part of the proverb is, if you give a man a fish, he'll eat it for a day. If you teach them to fish, he will
eat for a lifetime.
Thank you. It's a quiet crowd. We gotta work on this. So the idea here is kind of the idea of development, right? And the idea there of teaching someone to fish is we know something that they don't, right? That we can teach them something. But what I'd like to talk about more today is the idea of justice and injustice. So injustice, Gary Haugen defines it as an individual or group misusing power. Misusing power to take another's life, liberty, dignity, the fruits of their love and labor. So the idea here would be that there's a bunch of poor fishermen fishing this lake. And a corrupt official ends up fencing in the lake. And not only fences in the lake, but he takes the fishermen's boats away from them. Says, wait a minute, I'm going to have my own crews of fishing people going out to fish. They're going to use your boats. I've taken your boats. I've fenced in the lake. You can no longer fish here. That's the difference kind of between charity, development, and justice. So the justice work is fighting injustice. It's that the poor have a right to fish. This is a public lake, and those were their boats. That guy had no right to neither fence in the lake nor take away their boats. So when people say, what is justice work about? What is it? My shorthand little definition is justice work almost always makes someone mad because you're messing with power. They're misusing power and you're trying to correct that. It's going to make somebody mad. If we teach someone to fish, nobody gets mad. If we give them a fish, even less so. right? The charity development justice work gets someone mad. So if we end up collecting evidence on that this guy broke the law by fencing in the lake, and he broke the law by taking away those fishing boats, and we ended up getting him arrested and goes to trial, he's going to be mad, right? He's going to try and use his power now, maybe not against the fishermen, but against us. So at AGS, we work on two themes. I usually talk about them in the negative. It's violence and corruption. Here in the slide, they're positive: peace and security, and anti-corruption or transparency. And we haven't picked these topics randomly, right? It's not that we work in a zillion different countries. We work just in Honduras. And these are two of not the most important topics among the most. So maybe some of you already know Honduras was the highest homicide rate in the world in 2012, 2013. It looks like 2014 Venezuela will pass Honduras, which honestly makes me happy. Makes me sad for Venezuela, it makes me happy for Honduras to not be number one. So we are focusing on an extremely important issue for Honduras. And corruption, Honduras is in the bottom 5 in Latin America. There's sort of the bottom 5 of the barrel. So these two issues are very important for Honduras. What I'd like to argue today with you guys is that violence and corruption are among the topics which most hurt the poor. Not only are they among the most important topics for the poor, I think they're very important topics for God. So read the prophets, right? I just wrote down one verse, Isaiah 61:8. For I, the Lord, love justice. I hate robbery and wrongdoing. And I could come up with 100 verses like that. God loves justice. He hates robbery and wrongdoing. Basically, he hates corruption and robbery. He hates corruption and violence. The New Testament talks about justice 350 times. So violence and corruption are hurting the poor. They're topics God cares about. I think it's on the next slide. And surprisingly, this topics, so Calvin has an international development studies program. I graduated from Cornell. I didn't have one class on violence. I had one little piece of a class on corruption in a PhD program on international development. Calvin has no classes that include the topic of violence, and a little bit on corruption in a couple of classes. So these are dramatically affecting the lives of the poor, but they have been off the radar. They're not in our churches. You don't hear sermons on violence and corruption. They're not on the agendas of our short-term mission trips. We don't go to Honduras or Mexico to work on the issues of corruption or violence. If you look at the websites of World Vision, Compassion, who would be all the other big organizations that you know, but all those Christian and non-Christian organizations, you may see mentions of corruption, minor, and probably no mentions of violence. These are not topics that they work on. And even in our own lives, I think we often haven't prioritized this. I'm really interested in agriculture development. I want to help poor people. And how are you going to do that? Well, agriculture, microenterprise, Kiva. But I don't hear students or faculty talking about these issues of violence and corruption. So when I was preparing this presentation, I had long sections trying to demonstrate the importance of these in the lives of the poor, the importance of these for God, and how they were absent. And then I ended up basically repeating everything that's in Gary Haugen's The Locus Effect book. Has anybody read this? It's a fabulous book. I mean, I'm a little biased because this is my stuff, right? But I think all of you would like to read it. It's not an easy read. It's hard to read, but it's super interesting. And it basically does what I just said. It shows how violence and corruption are affecting the lives of the poor everywhere, and how these are huge topics, and how neither the church, nor the universities, nor development organizations are paying attention to it. So if you want to read a book, it's a great one. But he also addresses why he thinks these are not being addressed in churches, in development fields, in organizations like World Vision, etc. And he makes one argument, and I'd like to add a second. First of all, he says it's because we're afraid. We are afraid that if World Vision gets involved in violence and power and corruption, World Vision employees might get killed, or that donors won't want to give money to it anymore. There's a fear piece, and I think he's completely right. We're also afraid that we will see our role, that we are partly responsible for these problems, and that makes us afraid. So I think fear is a big piece. But as I was getting this presentation ready, I started thinking more about it. I think it's more than just fear. And I've heard myself say it, I've heard other people say it, I've heard students say it, and that all these macro topics, corruption, like corruption in Honduras. Oh, corruption in Honduras, that's just too hard. That's too complicated. It's too political. Like, we're just a little NGO, or we're a Christian little organization, we're a church, we're a short-term mission. We can't get involved in that. We could build a school, but we couldn't fix corruption in the Honduran school system. Like, that's just too big. And I want to argue today 3 things. First of all, that it isn't too big. We can make a difference. Churches, individuals, organizations, in these issues of justice, violence, and corruption. Not only can we, but God wants us to. We should not continue to leave these topics off our agenda, and that we can make a difference. So I'm going to tell you 3 stories now about addressing these issues, and I always like listening to stories, so I hope you like stories. The first one is Los Encapuchados. So encapuchados in Spanish is like masked men, which in Honduras usually means ski masks. And in 2001, we moved to a neighborhood called Nueva Suyapa. We didn't know it at the time. We had been going to church there for about 10 years. We ended up finding it was the most violent neighborhood in all of Honduras. We just knew it was where our church was, and we thought it would be fun to live there. And I came home a few months after we moved up there one night, and my daughter, Anna, and Noah were crying, and Joanne was upset. And I was like, what's going on? And they said, well, they sent them all home from school early today because Anna and Noah's classmate's dad was killed this morning. And they're really not sure what happened. So they ended up the kids were all worked up, and they sent them home. And I ended up talking to Carlos, who's co-founder of AGS with me, and he was the principal of the school at that time. And I ended up finding out that the dad sold fruits and vegetables out of the back of a pickup truck. He was a peddler. And every morning he would have $100, $150 in his pocket because he would go and buy a new supply of fruits and vegetables and then spend the day going around and selling. So as he was pulling his pickup away from his house, 3 masked men walked up to him and stole his money. His wife and kids were there ready to close the garage door. And he gave him the money, no resistance. After he gave him the money, they shot him in the head. No reason, like no protest, no fight. They just, like, they wanted to. So I was shocked, and Carlos was shocked, and we went home and prayed with the kids, and, God, what should we do about this? Or, we didn't pray that. God, please be with the widow and the kids, and, help the kids at school to find peace. But 2 days later, Carlos showed up at my house, and the widow had been to his house. And the widow said, we know who did it. In fact, I have 2 witnesses who were coming to my house as the bad guys were going around the corner and taking their ski masks off. And they live 2 blocks away. We know who they are, we know where they live, and we have witnesses willing to testify. So Carlos and I ran this little justice organization. So you'd think, well, like, if that happened in Santa Barbara, what do? You know who did it, you know where they live, you know their names, what do? Come on. You call the police, dial 911, right? I mean, it's simple. But in Honduras, like, you're not sure, right? What if you knew that 1 in 10 of the Santa Barbara cops were dirty? And instead of going to arrest the bad guys, or even if they arrest them, after they arrested them, they would say it was, what's your name?
My name?
Yeah.
Alexandra.
It's Alexandra who is the witness. She's the one who saw you. And that one bad cop is going to sneak into the file and find out Alexandra's name, where she lives, and that she's the witness, and he's going to go tell the bad guys. Like if you had a 1 in 10 chance that the Santa Barbara cops were going to get you killed, would you go to the cops? You would think twice. And if it was 2 in 10, you'd be like, no way, right? I mean, it shows how it only takes 1 in 10 to make everybody nervous. And you don't really know if it's 1 in 10 or a 1 in 100, but you know that sometimes that evidence in Honduras leaks out. So we couldn't just go to the cops. We had to figure out how to do this carefully and wisely, and honestly, we all had other stuff to do. And it ended up taking us over 2 months before we ended up getting an appointment with the cop that everybody said we could trust and would protect us and protect the widow and protect the kids. And we had a meeting and we told them, and we were busy setting up the meeting between the widow and this cop, and these 3 guys shot an off-duty police officer. And the whole police force responded. 15 vehicles, a helicopter, they cornered them, they ended up shooting one of them was wounded, and one of them escaped over the back gate of the fence of the house. And Carlos and I ended up, a couple weeks later, we were sitting around, and we didn't do it all then, but we started keep counting how many people had been killed from the time we knew who the bad guys were till the day that they were shot and arrested. We came up with 13 men. 13 dads and husbands were killed after we knew who they were. So here we are running a justice organization, and we could have stopped 13 men from being killed, and we didn't. And we had a problem, right? I mean, we had a problem just like everybody in our neighborhood did. You couldn't trust, we didn't know if we could trust the cops. And that fear blocked us from doing anything. And so what would be the typical response, like of the church, of us, when, the husband's killed? Like, what's the charity? What's the development response? Well, we're going to pray for your family. Or, you lost your breadwinner. We'll be giving you food for a couple months. Or we'll have a prayer meeting at church about violence in our neighborhood. That's usually what the response is. But Carlos and I that night when we were talking said, we're not going to do that again. And so like what would justice do? Carlos and I promised, next time we're going to do something, and we didn't know what. And we started planning. And 8 months later, so after these 3 guys were killed, the whole neighborhood got safer. Those 3 guys were terrorizing. But 8 months later, there's a group of young men doing the same thing again. Robbing, raping, killing, often just seemed like for fun. We ended up hiring 3 people. Oops, dang. These 2 were our first 2. So he's an ex-cop, and he's an ex-prosecutor, both Christians. What do ex-cops know that I don't know? Who's the bad cops and who's the good cops? And what does an ex-prosecutor know? Who the good prosecutors and who the bad prosecutors are. We had a bridge now. We had an informant. We had somebody that we could say, Luis, who's our ex-cop, Luis, we got witnesses. We know who did this. You make sure it goes to the good cops and that they don't leak any of that information. You keep our people safe. And they did. And what we ended up finding, very interestingly, is the community didn't trust the cops, but the cops also didn't trust the community. That was completely new. And why wouldn't they, right? But actually, why would they when you think about it? The cop, He's got 3 kids and a wife. So Alexandra, right? Did I say Alexandra?
Yes.
Yes. So Alexandra is a witness to a crime. She saw them kill the guy. And she's willing to testify because she's just mad. They end up arresting the guy. Alexandra has to show up at the police station within 24 hours. You need a credible witness to keep them in jail more than 24 hours. Do we think Alexandra's going to show up after 24 hours to say, those are the 3 guys? What do you think?
Why not?
Let's give her the benefit of the doubt. She's pretty brave and she's pretty mad. So she shows up in the 24 hours. They hold the guys over. In 3 months, there's a pre-trial hearing. Do we think 3 months later Alexandra's going to show up? Her family's been telling Alexandra, don't be stupid. Don't go. Don't go. So maybe she's brave enough. A year later, it goes to trial. It's been a year since she saw the crime. She's not mad anymore. Now and her family's been telling her, don't do this, don't do this. She doesn't show up. So now you're the cop who had to bust down the door and arrest the gang members, risk your life. You got kids, and you know Alexandra, she's not going to show up for trial. Like, why am I going to risk my life and my kids to arrest somebody that the witnesses are never going to show up? So Alexandra doesn't trust me, but I don't trust her either. And you see how the whole system then falls apart. Because when I do finally arrest somebody, if Alexandra doesn't show up in 24 hours, what happens to the bad guys?
They come after you.
They go back out on the street. They may come after me, but they're back out on the street. And are they going to tell the neighbors, well, I'm back out on the street because Alexandra didn't show up? No, they're going to say, I got the judge in my pocket. The cops are in my pocket. It's not true. The witness didn't show up. That's why they're back out on the street. But they're going to make it look like they run the city, right? So the community even believes less what the police say because the bad guys are out there spreading very powerful rumors, and it looks true. They got arrested. 24 hours later, they're back out on the street. Those bad cops. I'll say another word, but I won't. So you see how this mistrust, and this is interesting, I think, even here in the United States, how fragile our systems are. And I worry about this, like the way people talk trash about government. You know, the Congress, Washington, Obama, Bush, you know, they're all bad, they're all stupid, and you see how fragile these systems are and how quickly this could all fall apart. So, something to think about. So what happened in our project? We now have these bridges of trust, and that red line is the murder rate in our neighborhood. We had 120 per 100,000. I'll just do it in straight numbers. In 2005, when we started, we had 42 homicides. 2013 was our best year. We had 8. We went from 42 homicides to 8. We figure we have saved over 600 people. If the homicide rate in our neighborhood had stayed at its top level, 600 more people in my neighborhood would have died if we had done nothing. Instead, we have 8. Now, 8 is awful. But look what the homicide rate in the country was doing. While the Honduras homicide rate is tripling, the homicide rate in our neighborhood went down 80%. And that's like counter trend. Sociologists like me, like, that's impressive. To buck a national trend like that in the most violent neighborhood, something was going on. We had 3 employees, an ex-cop, an ex-prosecutor, and a psychologist. 3 people did that. It doesn't take an army. It doesn't have to be so hard, so long, so complicated. We can figure this stuff out. Story 2. Questions? This is Julieta Castellanos. She's the president of the National University in Honduras, 80,000 students. So she's a big deal. It's a big university. In 2011, that's her son, Carlos. In 2011, he was 19 years old. That's right when the picture was taken. Was on his way home from a birthday party. 8 on-duty police officers in uniform, in police cars, tried to steal his vehicle. He and his friend take off. The police chase them. They end up shooting him with an M16, so an assault weapon. Went right through the body of the car and right through his abdomen. So when he's shot, he stops. He says, "Take the car, but get me to the hospital. My mom is the president of the National University." I mean, he says that thinking, this will keep me safe. These cops will be afraid, when it does the exact opposite. And you can guess, shit. We just shot the son of the president of the university. They call their bosses. They end up taking him outside of town, him and his friend who is unhurt, and shoot them both in the back of the head. The president of the university, being who she is, calls all of her resources in. They collect videotapes, they find witnesses, they end up proving that it was these 8 cops. They have surveillance footage of gas stations and Chinese restaurants. You can see them chasing, you can see them shooting, you see them taking them in the back of the pickup truck to where they're going to shoot them. And again, we have now a worse case scenario than the one in our neighborhood. Not only do we guess that some cops are bad, we now know cops. This was a car theft ring. They did this every weekend. They would steal 3 or 4 cars a weekend, this group of 8. And most of the victims, because they're cops, wouldn't do anything about it. They'd end up selling them in Guatemala. So again, what is our typical response to a situation like this? As church, as individuals, as Christians, it tends to be a charity / we could provide counseling maybe for her. We can have a big multi-church, all the churches in the area are going to get together and have a prayer service. We're going to pray for safety. We're going to pray for, but the church, we don't get involved. I mean, what could we do? It's too complicated. And we're afraid, like that, both of those pieces again. So again, we tried to ask the question, what would justice do? So we actually did. We helped the police because we had this experience in Nueva Suyapa. Julieta asked us, would you help me? And we ended up catching 6 of the 8 cops are in jail. 2 of them are still on the run, probably somewhere in the US, we guess. But 6 of them got caught, tried, and convicted for the killing. But we also ended up forming an alliance of, and here's a bunch of the names, and you'll recognize at least a couple of them. World Vision. The first one there is the National University that Julieta is the president of. Caritas, which is the Catholic Relief Services of the Catholic Church. And AJS over down in here in this corner. We formed an alliance and we started pressuring. We said, this is it. The government has to clean out the police force. 12,000 officers. We want polygraphs. We want drug testing. We want to, and so far they've fired over 2,200 cops for failing polygraphs, drug tests, still more to do. But we ended up finding out it's not just that all the cops are bad. We already knew that in Nueva Suyapa, remember? The community didn't trust the cops, but the cops didn't trust the community. We went to the 2nd largest city in Honduras, San Pedro Sula. It's 1 million people. Highest homicide rate in the world. San Pedro is worse than Tegucigalpa. 30 homicides a week. They had 22 homicide detectives. Of those 22, a third usually are either on vacation or sick or in some training. So that's down to 14 cops investigating 30 homicides a week. They get 2 new cases every week. If you ask a homicide detective in the US, it takes them about a month to do a good homicide investigation. 1 month for 1 case for 1 detective. These detectives in San Pedro Sula had 2 vehicles for the 22 detectives. So imagine, right? You're one of those 22. You get a new 2 new cases a week, and you got to figure out how to share 1 pickup truck with 12 of you, 15 of you. So is it that they're all corrupt? Is it that they're bad cops? One of the cops just made an argument a couple weeks ago. I loved it. He said, we have the best cops in the world, which is certainly not true. But I liked his argument. it's amazing that we arrest anybody in Honduras, given the resources we have, the training we have. And I'm like, well, yeah, you're kind of right. It is pretty amazing that anybody gets arrested in Honduras, given that. So again, like, it's easy to, like, it's just the bad cops. No, there's not enough of them. They don't have enough vehicles. They don't have, you know, the luminol to spray on the blood, you know, all the CSI stuff. They got none of that. So we need to resource these. We need to clean out the cops, but we need more of them, and we need better training and better resources. So we have developed those sorts of proposals. We do the investigations. What's wrong in the police force? How are we going to fix it? We had 19 meetings with the president of Honduras last year, just about this topic. I mean, more than once a month. We were meeting talking about how to clean up the police force, how to bring in Colombian advisors, how to hire new cops. And lots of our suggestions have been taken into account. So again, like, it doesn't have to be so hard, so complicated. And what's the results? There's our homicide rate. Now, I'm not going to take full credit for all of this. I'm having trouble with this. But this is when our alliance was formed, 2012. So doesn't that look nice? The homicide rate has dropped 20 points in the last 2 years, 30%. Hit a high of 86. So Los Angeles' homicide rate is around 8 or 10. This is the worldwide average is here, 8. This was Honduras. Honduras has triple the homicide rate of Mexico, quadruple Iraq. Right? So this is just crazy levels of violence. But it's dropped 30% in 2 years. And the experts say that's unheard of. You like to go 5, maybe 10 points in 2 years. That would be good. You start seeing a trend. To have that sort of drop is, and we could talk more about why. But again, what the church, what Christians, what groups of us can do on big issues. Not just like, let's pray about this. Let's provide counseling to the victims. We can change these sorts of lines. Last story. Education. So in 2010, 5 years ago, we started studying what was broken in the Honduran education system. We knew it was a mess. We didn't really know why. We had some ideas. Lots of surprising stuff came out. I'm going to give you 4 statistics, and only 2 of them are up there, so you have to stick them in your brain. First of all, Honduras spends 27% of its budget on education. That surprised me. That's way higher than I thought it would be. Over a quarter of the budget goes to education. I think policing in the military is like 6%. So Honduras spends way more money on education than police and security. Maybe that's a problem, right? We were just looking at the other. But Honduras spends a lot of money on education. But in 2010, Honduras by law, they're supposed to teach 200 days. Kids were only getting 120 days of classes. That means they're losing 80 days every year. Now imagine in high school, if you missed 80 days of geometry. Would you be ready for what comes after geometry? Algebra? No, algebra first, right? And then geometry? What if you missed 80 days of algebra? Would you be ready for geometry? And then you missed another 80 days of geometry. Would you be ready for pre-calc? And then you missed 80 days of pre-calc. Would you be like, you know how math builds on itself, right? Imagine like being a first grader and missing 80 days of learning how to read. And you miss 80 days of addition and subtraction. And then you get to multiplication, you're like, I don't even understand addition. And then you get to division, and then you get to fractions, and you miss 80 days of all of that. Like, by 4th grade, you don't understand math. So the importance of days of school. And this was almost all because of strikes. Teachers' unions striked 70 to 80 days a year. There were 26% of the teachers, again, we did studies. We were studying how many days of school. We got the payroll of the whole country for teachers. And we went to a sampling of schools, a random sample. We ended up finding out 26% of the teachers on the payroll weren't actually in the classroom. Out of 60,000 teachers, that was 15,000 teachers. They didn't know where they were. The government had no idea. The government didn't even know how many teachers there were. The Minister of Education told us in one meeting, there's somewhere between 60 and 80,000 teachers. Like if Biola said, we have somewhere between 200 and 300 faculty. We don't really know. We write paychecks, but it could be 200, it could be 300, but it's somewhere in, you can't run a business, you can't run a school system like that. That's how broken the Honduran education system was. And the worst thing is that the test scores, so you guys take the Iowa basics and that stuff, Honduran schools take those. For 10 years, flat. So Honduras is spending 27% of its budget on education and getting no results, no improvement. Like that's bad, right? So we started investigating. What again would be like the typical sort of charity response? Like, these kids are not learning. The schools aren't working. What could we do? Some of you maybe do it. You could do tutoring. We could train some teachers a little better. We could buy books for the school. But is that the problem? Is that going to fix it? No, we could tutor one kid. We could get our whole church to tutor 50 kids. There's 2.3 million kids in the Honduran school system. Like, how are we going to get all those kids? We have to fix the system, not like Band-Aids, not like... So what did we do? We did investigations. We wrote proposals. We met a few times with the president. We got the Minister of Education fired. And we met with him a bunch of times. We tried to get him to fix things. He was incompetent. And we finally went to the president and said, you got to fire him. You got to hire a new guy. And he did. Hired a new guy, and he said, the first thing I want you to do, I want you to meet with these people because I'm sick of these scandals. I'm sick of these press conferences. 26% of teachers, we don't know where they are. 120 days of school. Fix it. And we started fixing it. And here's the results. The last 2 years, Honduras has averaged 218 days of school. 100 more days like that. We turned it around like that. From 1 year to the next, went from 120 to almost 220. And I can tell you more about how, but that's amazing, right? Instead of 26% of school teachers, they don't know where they are, it's down to 1%. Oh, and I missed one piece. So the United Nations, remember I told you they do these test scores, right? The standardized tests. The United Nations compiles the results of these around Latin America. 15 Latin American countries. Honduras, for the last, I don't know how many years, is always last. 15 out of 15. And 3 years ago, the United Nations, UNESCO, some of you know who that is, United Nations Education, Science, something or other. And Cultural Organization, that's it. They do, every 3 years, they compile these results around the world, but in Latin America. And 4 years ago, they said that Honduras was going to take 100 years to catch up to Costa Rica. And I remember that made me so mad. And Carlos, sort of co-founder, like we both heard it, we were not together, and we both got to the office, and he's like, oh, I'm so mad. I'm like, what are you mad about? He's like, I heard this thing, 100 years, he's like, that's bullshit. And I'm like, yeah, and I was like, that made me really mad too. So we have this, right? United Nations, October 4, did a new compilation of results. You can look it up, October 4, 2014. Honduras, in 3 years, went from 15 to 10th. In 3 years, from 15th to 10th, after not having any improvement. Costa Rica is 4th. I'm like, we are coming for you, Costa Rica. It's not going to be 100 years. Like, maybe it'll take 10, maybe it'll take 15, but we are coming for you. Like, again, 20% increase in 3 years. Like, this is not in one school. This is in the whole schools. I mean, you pick the worst school in California, and you try and improve their scores 20% in 2 years, it would be really hard. Honduras got 20% improvement in the whole, all the schools. It's about, dang. I get a little agitated. It's about this, right? We got teachers actually in the classroom and teaching the right amount of days. That was enough to just make a huge change in kids' test scores in 2 years. I'll put it back on. So, those are my 3 stories. One neighborhood's violence, a nation's violence, and the story of Julieta and her son. She's an amazing woman, by the way, super brave, super cool. And education. So, yeah. Oh, dang. How did okay, I thought I had a lot more time. 4 lessons, and I'll end. Hopefully, I have a few minutes for questions. First of all, I think it's important that we recognize that not everything is justice. And so I go to churches, I meet on college campuses, and say, oh yeah, we have a justice committee. We're running a food pantry. We have a justice committee. We're doing job training. We have a justice committee. We're building wells in Africa. Is that making anybody mad? Right? Are we addressing power at all? Like, is somebody who's misusing power being stopped? I mean, those are good things. It's not that, but it's not justice work. And if we say everything is justice, then sort of nothing is justice, right? And I think the second thing I often hear is that I'm really interested in justice. This is mostly on college campuses, but some in churches too. I'm really interested in justice. I'm interested in sex trafficking and child slavery. And those are justice issues. But justice is so much bigger than that. And IJM, I know where it comes from. IJM has been super successful in promoting justice, and those are their 2 topics. But like what we talked about today, education and neighborhood violence and gang violence, those are justice issues. There's very little sex trafficking in Honduras. So we could go in and do sex trafficking work. But what are the big justice issues that affect Honduras? It's not those. So I think we need to start asking, what are the justice issues in this neighborhood, in this community? What are the justice issues in Santa Barbara? What are the justice issues in Los Angeles? And not like, oh, everywhere it's sex trafficking, or everywhere. Like, what are the biggest issues for this group? And that feeds into my second thing. These are not just Honduras problems. These are U.S. problems. 4 of the top 40 most violent cities in the world are in the United States. St. Louis, Detroit, New Orleans, Baltimore. There are neighborhoods in these communities that are more violent than my neighborhood. There are neighborhoods in Detroit, St. Louis, and New Orleans that have 100+ homicides per 100,000. There is no other rich country in the world on that list. That whole list of most violent cities, it's all poor countries and the United States. There's no European cities. There's no rich Asian countries. Canada's not on there. It's just the U.S. Something is screwed up in the U.S. And what are we doing about that? About guns and about violence in our neighborhoods. And violence and mistrust of the police is also not just, remember I told you the cops didn't trust the community doesn't trust. That's not just in Honduras. Look at Ferguson. Look at Cleveland. Look at Los Angeles, right? Poor people don't trust the cops, and the cops don't trust poor people. And it causes all, what are we doing about that? We're figuring stuff out in Honduras. Are they figuring stuff out here? Are you guys? School system. I looked it up last night. Kern County, you know where that is? Bakersfield is Kern County. Most of the schools in Kern County have less than $6,000 a year per student. Do you guys know where Montecito Union School is? It's right around here somewhere, right?
Right down the street.
Yeah. Over $21,000 per student. Like, is that just? The kids who least need a really good school got $21,000 a student. The kids who most need a really good school are the least likely to get one. This isn't California. This is the whole United States. The way we have set up our public school system is not really public. It's not equal. If you live in a rich neighborhood, your parents could send you to a private school if they wanted to. We basically have public schools run like private schools. And you get all your neighbors, actually, to pay for your kids to go to a really expensive school. Like, that's screwed up. Right? So these are not Honduras issues. These are U.S. issues. And it makes me happy, excited. Like, the U.S. could learn from what we're doing in Honduras, fixing the education and fixing mistrust between cops and communities. Makes me happy. And we can do this, right? It's not it's not so complicated. It's not so hard. It's not going to be, that if we change policy, it'll take forever. We'll never be able to do it. So then we don't even try. God wants us to do this. We need to ask, what are these issues? What can we do? And we just had somebody from Chicago studying our work, and they're interested in studying in Chicago, and he said something I really liked. He said, our culture has been telling us a lie, and those of us here who are parents say it's especially true for parents, that our number 1 and 2 concerns, first of all, it's safety, and second is comfort. And so you can't live in that neighborhood. That's not safe. And you have kids and you live in that neighborhood? How could you? He said, I don't see that anywhere in the Bible, is his final statement, right? There's nowhere in the Bible, be safe. And certainly not above, it does not trump love God above all and love your neighbor as yourself. So this idea of safety and comfort, we need to question it. We need to think critically about it. And what is God calling us to do? So, last slide. What will justice do? What will you do? I hope you get inspired a little bit to try and see how we can get these topics on the agenda. On the agenda here at Westmont, in the classes that violence and corruption need to be addressed, in our churches, in our short-term missions. Maybe you're not doing that in your short-term missions, but you talk about it. You learn what are the justice issues in this country where I'm visiting in short-term missions. And then maybe a few of you say, I want to do something with this with my career. Or I want to go to Honduras and study more about this stuff, that this becomes part of who we are in Los Angeles or in Chicago or where we end up. And I'll end with 2 quotes. Gary Haugen, efforts to end global poverty and secure the most basic human rights for the poor are failing because crime and violence against the poor are not being addressed. I mean, that's his thesis of that book. And it would be my thesis today too. If we really care about the poor, if we don't address these issues, all our work is going to mostly get wasted, right? And then Proverbs 31:8 and 9. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy. So that is the AGS theme for this year, is speak up. And I think all of us, this idea of brave Christians, we need to speak up. And I'm always a little careful of this. It's not sometimes speak up for those who cannot speak. No, it's not that they can't speak, right? They do speak, but their voices are not being heard. How can we amplify the voices of those who are suffering from violence and corruption around the world? So thank you.